I'm Sarah Martinez, 28, and the moment I posted that invoice in our family group chat, you could practically hear the digital silence echo across 3 states. My sister Jessica had been calling me ungrateful for months. My parents insisted I should feel honored to watch her kids every weekend, and they all thought I'd just keep taking it. But when they saw that itemized bill for 47 hours of childcare, complete with overtime rates and emotional labor fees, their tune changed real quick. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up in the Martinez household meant understanding an unspoken hierarchy where Jessica, being the eldest at 32, somehow inherited the right to everyone else's time and energy. Our parents, Maria and Carlos, had immigrated from Mexico in the 1980s, working double shifts to build the life they wanted for us. They instilled values of family loyalty and sacrifice that ran deeper than blood, but somewhere along the way, those values got twisted into a weapon that Jessica wielded with surgical precision. I should have seen the pattern forming years ago, back when Jessica first got pregnant with Emma, now 8 years old. I was fresh out of college, working my first real job at a marketing firm and living in a cramped studio apartment that smelled perpetually of the Indian restaurant downstairs. Jessica lived in her perfect suburban house with her husband Mike, who traveled for work constantly, leaving her to manage their growing family alone. At least, that's how she painted the picture. The requests started small, as they always do. Could I watch Emma for a few hours while she ran errands? Of course I could. Could I take Emma overnight because she needed some rest? Absolutely. Family helps family, right? That's what our parents had drilled into us since childhood, and I wore that responsibility like a badge of honor. I genuinely loved being an aunt. Loved Emma's infectious giggles and the way she'd curl up next to me during movie nights, her tiny fingers sticky with popcorn butter. But then came Liam, now 5, and suddenly Jessica's definition of a few hours stretched into entire weekends. Then came Sophia, the 3-year-old tornado who could destroy a room faster than I could childproof it. With each addition to her family, Jessica's demands on my time multiplied exponentially, while her gratitude seemed to evaporate entirely. The breaking point should have been months ago, maybe even years ago, but I kept making excuses for the growing resentment that churned in my stomach every Friday when Jessica would text me her weekend plans. Spa retreats with her college friends, brunches that lasted until evening, shopping trips that somehow required 12 hours away from her children. Meanwhile, I spent my weekends changing diapers, mediating sibling fights, and trying to keep 3 kids entertained, while my own life slowly disappeared. My friends stopped inviting me to things because they knew I'd have to cancel. My date-in life became non-existent because who wants to compete with weekend babysitting duties? I watched my peers advance in their careers, take spontaneous trips, and build relationships while I became the family's unpaid nanny. The worst part wasn't the sacrifice itself. It was the complete lack of acknowledgement that I was sacrificing anything at all. Jessica had this way of framing her requests that made refusal seem selfish and cruel. She'd call me crying about how overwhelmed she was, how Mike's job demanded so much travel, how she just needed a break to be herself again. She'd paint these elaborate pictures of her mental health hanging by a thread, her marriage suffering, her identity lost in the chaos of motherhood. And I'd listen, heartbreaking for her, rushing over with my weekend bag packed and my own plans abandoned. But then I'd see her Instagram posts from those same weekends, perfectly curated shots of mimosa flights and infinity pool lounging, designer shopping bags, and girls' trips to wine country. She'd caption them with things like, much-needed self-care weekend, and finally remembering who I am outside of mom life, while I was at home dealing with Sophia's tantrum about the wrong color sippy cup and Emma's tears. Over some playground drama, the cognitive dissonance started eating away at me. If Jessica was so overwhelmed and desperate, why did her breaks always look like luxury vacations? If she was struggling financially with 3 kids, how could she afford these monthly getaways? And why was it that every family gathering somehow became a conversation about how hard Jessica's life was and how grateful she should be to have such a supportive sister? Our parents, bless their hard-working hearts, seemed to operate under the assumption that Jessica's needs automatically trumped everyone else's. They'd arrived at this conclusion through some twisted logic that equated having children with deserving unlimited support from childless family members. When I tried to express my frustration, Mom would launch into stories about how families in Mexico always helped each other, how children belonged to the whole village, how selfish American individualism was destroying traditional values. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica had moved to the suburbs specifically to escape that kind of communal child-rearing, but apparently it only applied to her receiving help, not giving it. She'd never once offered to watch a friend's kids, never volunteered for school events that might interfere with her schedule, never reciprocated the kind of support she demanded from everyone else. Dad would chime in with his own guilt trips, talking about how proud he was to see his daughters supporting each other, how important it was for the kids to have strong family bonds, how children needed stability, consistency in their lives. He wasn't wrong about any of that, but he conveniently ignored the fact that I was the only one providing that stability and consistency while Jessica flitted in and out of her children's lives like a part-time worker's parent. The final straw came on a particularly brutal Friday in November. I'd been working overtime all week on a major campaign launch, surviving on coffee and determination, looking forward to a quiet weekend of recovery. I had plans to meet my college roommate Sarah, who was visiting from Portland, something we'd been planning for months. I'd already made dinner reservations, bought tickets to a show, cleared my entire weekend for the first time in ages. That's when Jessica called, her voice already thick with tears before I even said hello. Mike had supposedly gotten called away on an emergency business trip, she explained through dramatic sobs, and she'd already booked a wellness retreat in Sedona that she just couldn't cancel. The deposit was non-refundable, her mental health was at stake, and she absolutely had to go. Could I please watch the kids? Just this once? She promised it was the last time she'd ask for something so last minute. I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the one that had controlled my decisions for so many years. The guilt, the obligation, the deeply ingrained belief that saying no made me a terrible sister and an even worse person. But this time, something else stirred alongside those familiar feelings. Anger. Pure, clean anger at being treated like an on-call babysitter whose time and plans meant nothing. "I can't this weekend, Jess," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I have plans that I've been looking forward to for months." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Jessica's voice came back, but this time it wasn't tearful. It was cold, sharp, accusatory. "Seriously? You're going to abandon me when I need you most? What plans could possibly be more important than helping your family?" I explained about Sarah's visit, about how long we'd been planning this, about how I needed this weekend for my own mental health. Each word felt like I was justifying my right to exist as something other than Jessica's backup childcare plan. "So you're choosing some college friend over your own nieces and nephew?" Over your sister who's struggling? That's incredibly selfish, Sarah. I never thought you could be so cold. The conversation devolved from there, with Jessica cycling through every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. I was ungrateful for all the time she'd helped me, though I couldn't remember a single instance of such help. I was jealous of her perfect family and trying to sabotage her happiness. I was being brainwashed by childless friends who didn't understand the sacrifices of motherhood. I was abandoning family values and becoming one of those career-obsessed women who'd end up alone and bitter. Each accusation hit like a physical blow, but I held firm. I had plans. I deserved to have plans. I was not responsible for managing Jessica's life choices or compensating for her husband's travel schedule or providing her with consequence-free motherhood. The call ended with Jessica's voice reaching a pitch that probably disturbed neighborhood dogs. She was going to call our parents. She was going to tell them exactly what kind of person I really was. She was going to make sure everyone knew how I'd betrayed the family when they needed me most. The threats felt empty, but I knew she'd follow through. Jessica never made empty threats when it came to recruitment of parental guilt. Sure enough, my phone rang an hour later. Mom's number flashed on the screen, and I knew I was about to face the full force of Martina's family disappointment. I considered not answering, but that would only make things worse. Better to face the music head-on. "Mija, what is this I hear about you refusing to help your sister?" Mom's voice carried that particular tone of wounded disappointment that she'd perfected over decades of motherhood. It was the same tone she'd used when I got a B+ in calculus junior year. The same tone she'd used when I chose marketing over law school. The same tone that somehow made me feel like a small child who'd broken something precious. I explained the situation again, about Sarah's visit, about needing this one weekend, about how I'd been helping Jessica every weekend for months without complaint. Mom listened with the kind of silence that meant she was formulating her counter-argument, not actually hearing what I was saying. "Sarah, honey, family comes first. Always. Your friend will understand if you explain about the emergency. Jessica is your sister, and she needs you. Those children need their Tia. How can you be so selfish when your sister is struggling?" The word selfish hit me like a slap. Selfish. After years of sacrificing my weekends, my social life, my dating prospects, my career advancement opportunities, my mental health, I was being called selfish for wanting one weekend to myself. It's not selfish to have my own life, Mom. I've been helping Jessica every weekend for months. I'm entitled to make my own plans sometimes. Entitled? Mom's voice sharpened. Since when do we talk about being entitled in this family? We talk about responsibility, about love, about supporting each other. Jessica has 3 children. Sarah, 3 little ones who need care and stability. You have no children, no husband, no real responsibilities. You should be honored that Jessica trusts you with her most precious gifts. Honored. The word settled in my stomach like a stone. I should be honored to be taken advantage of. I should be honored to have my time treated as worthless. I should be honored to be the family's unpaid childcare service while Jessica lived her best life on social media. Dad took the phone then, his voice carrying that particular brand of paternal authority that brooked no argument. "Sarah, this is not who we raised you to be. Family helps family, no questions asked. Your sister needs you, and you're going to help her. Cancel your plans. There will be other weekends for friends." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with both parents taking turns explaining why I was wrong, why I was being unreasonable, why I was failing as a sister and a daughter and a human being. They brought up every sacrifice they'd made for us, every value they'd tried to instill, every example of proper family loyalty they could think of. They painted Jessica as a martyred saint struggling alone, while I lived my carefree, childless life with no understanding of real responsibility. By the time I hung up, I was shaking with a combination of rage and hurt that I'd never experienced before. The people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally had just spent 20 minutes telling me that my feelings, my time, and my needs were fundamentally less important than Jessica's. They'd made it clear that in their eyes, I existed primarily to serve my sister's convenience. I called Sarah in Portland and canceled our weekend, making up some vague excuse about a family emergency. She was disappointed but understanding, and that somehow made it worse. Even my friends had learned to expect that Jessica's needs would always come first, that I could never be counted on for anything that conflicted with my babysitting duties. That weekend, while Jessica posted photos from her Sedona retreat about finding her inner goddess and reconnecting with her authentic self, I dealt with Sophia's ear infection, Emma's friend drama, and Liam's mysterious aversion to any food that wasn't chicken nuggets. I administered medicine, mediated fights, cleaned up spills, and wondered when exactly I'd signed up to be a part-time parent to children who weren't mine. The breaking point came Sunday evening when Jessica returned from her retreat, glowing with spa treatments and spiritual enlightenment. She breezed into her house like a visiting celebrity, dispensing hugs and promises of quality time, while I gathered my things and prepared to return to my own neglected life. "Thanks so much for watching them," she said casually, not looking up from her phone where she was already scheduling her next girls' weekend. "They were good, right? No problems?" "No problems." As if Sophia's middle-of-the-night crying jag over missing her mommy wasn't a problem. As if Emma's questions about why mommy went away again weren't a problem. As if Liam's accident during his afternoon nap wasn't a problem I'd handled alone while trying to comfort a mortified 5-year-old. "There were a few issues," I started, but Jessica was already moving on, focused on her phone and her own agenda. "Great. Oh, and I might need you next weekend too. There's this amazing workshop in Tulum that my therapist recommended, and Mike's going to be in Chicago again. You're the best, sis." She said it so casually, with such complete assumption of my compliance, that something inside me finally snapped. The anger I'd been swallowing for years rose up like a tide, hot and clean and absolutely clarifying. "Actually, Jessica, I won't be available next weekend, or the weekend after that, or any weekend until further notice." She looked up from her phone then, her expression shifting from casual dismissal to genuine surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm done being your free babysitter. I have my own life to live, and I'm going to start living it." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation and emotional warfare. Jessica cycled through tears, accusations, threats, and guilt trips with the skill of someone who'd perfected these techniques over decades. I was abandoning her in her time of need. I was punishing innocent children for adult conflicts. I was being vindictive and cruel and selfish. I was destroying our family over petty jealousy and resentment. But this time, her words bounced off me like rain off a windshield. I'd heard it all before, and I'd finally recognized it for what it was, a carefully constructed narrative designed to keep me trapped in the role of unpaid servant. The spell was broken, and I could see the situation with startling clarity. I left Jessica's house that night, feeling lighter than I had in years, despite knowing that the real battle was just beginning. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Jessica, then from Mom, then from Dad, all variations on the same theme. I was being unreasonable. I was hurting the family. I needed to come to my senses and remember my obligations. But instead of caving to the pressure, I did something I'd never done before. I started keeping track. Every text demanding my time, every call filled with guilt trips, every assumption that my schedule belonged to everyone else. I documented the hours I'd spent babysitting, the plans I'd cancelled, the opportunities I'd missed. I researched childcare rates in our area, calculated overtime pay, factored in the emotional labor of managing 3 children while their mother pursued her self-actualization journey. The numbers were staggering. Over the past year alone, I'd provided over 200 hours of free childcare, worth approximately $3,000 at local babysitting rates. That didn't include the overtime rates for late pickups, the premium fees for last-minute requests, or the intangible costs of my own sacrificed plans and opportunities. I spent the week researching professional nanny services, looking up going rates for childcare in our area, calculating fair compensation for the services I'd been providing. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Jessica was saving hundreds of dollars every month by using me as free labor, money she was then spending on luxury retreats and shopping sprees while portraying herself as financially stressed. The idea came to me on Thursday night as I sat in my apartment, finally enjoying a quiet evening without the specter of weekend babysitting hanging over me. If Jessica wanted to treat me like a professional service, maybe it was time to start acting like one. Professional services sent invoices. They had contracts. They charged fair rates for their time and expertise. I opened my laptop and began crafting the most satisfying document I'd ever created. At the top, in professional letterhead I designed myself, I wrote, "Invoice for childcare services rendered." Below that, I itemized everything. Every weekend, every holiday, every last-minute emergency that had somehow become my responsibility. I included dates, hours, and rates based on the prevailing wages for professional childcare in our area. The total came to $4,732. I added a section for additional fees, late pickup charges for the times Jessica had returned hours after she'd promised, premium rates for holiday and last-minute care, and a new category I invented called Emotional Labor Surcharge for the Psychological Toll of Managing Other People's Children while Sacrificing My Own Well-Being. At the bottom I included payment terms: due upon receipt, late fees apply after 30 days, future child care services will require payment in advance. I stared at the completed invoice for a long time, my finger hovering over the send button. This would change everything. There would be no going back from this moment, no pretending that things could return to the old dynamic. But maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. I sent the invoice to Jessica first, with a professional note explaining that I'd decided to formalize our childcare arrangement going forward. If she wanted my services, she could pay fair market rates like any other parent. If she couldn't afford professional childcare, perhaps she needed to reconsider her recreational spending priorities. Jessica's response came within minutes. A string of text messages that started with confusion, moved through disbelief, and landed on pure rage. She called me petty, vindictive, and mercenary. She accused me of trying to profit off family relationships and destroying the bonds of sisterhood. She threatened to show the invoice to our parents as proof of my selfishness and greed. "Go ahead," I texted back. "I'm sure they'll be interested to see exactly how much free labor I've been providing." But Jessica predictably beat me to it. Within an hour, my phone was ringing with calls from both parents, their voices overlapping in a chorus of disbelief and disappointment. How could I reduce family love to dollars and cents? How could I be so cold and calculating about helping my own sister? How could I destroy the beautiful relationship I had with my nieces and nephew over money? I let them vent for a while, then calmly explained my position. I'd been providing professional-level childcare services for free while Jessica used that free labor to fund a lifestyle of luxury and leisure. If she wanted to continue using my services, she could pay what any other family would pay for the same level of care. "But your family," Mom protested. "Family doesn't charge each other for love." "You're right," I agreed. Family doesn't charge each other for love. But Jessica isn't asking for love. She's asking for a professional service that she's been getting for free while paying other people for massages and yoga retreats. The conversation continued for over an hour, with both parents taking turns trying to make me see reason. They brought up childhood memories of playing house with Jessica, reminded me of how much the kids loved their TIA, painted pictures of family gatherings ruined by this mercenary attitude I'd suddenly developed. But I held firm. If Jessica wanted my childcare services, she could pay for them, like any other parent. If she couldn't afford childcare, maybe she needed to reconsider her spending priorities or find other arrangements. I was done subsidizing her lifestyle with my free labor. The call ended with threats to cut me out of family gatherings, warnings that I was destroying relationships that could never be repaired, and promises that I'd regret this decision when I was old and alone with no family. Support me. The irony of threatening to withdraw family support from someone who'd been providing unpaid family support for years wasn't lost on me. Jessica's response to the invoice was to ignore it completely. Days passed, then weeks, with no acknowledgement that she owed me money or any indication that she planned to pay. She acted as if the entire thing had been some sort of joke, continuing to text about weekend plans and assuming I'd eventually come to my senses and resume my unpaid duties. When December rolled around and Jessica started making noises about needing help with holiday childcare, I knew it was time for the nuclear option. I'd given her 30 days to respond to the invoice, as clearly stated in my payment terms. Since she'd chosen to ignore it, late fees were now in effect, and it was time to make the matter public. I screenshot the invoice, including the payment terms, and the 30-day delinquency notice I'd sent as a follow-up. Then I posted it in our family group chat, the one that included Jessica, our parents, our aunts and uncles, and various cousins who'd been subjected to years of Jessica's martyrdom narrative. The caption was simple: "Since my previous invoice for childcare services has gone unpaid for 30 days, I'm making this matter public per standard collection procedures. Future childcare services will require, payment in advance." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the collective intake of breath as extended family members processed what they were seeing. Jessica, the perfect mother who sacrificed so much for her children, owed her sister nearly $5,000 for babysitting services. Jessica, who was always posting about her financial struggles, had been getting hundreds of dollars worth of free childcare every month while spending money on luxury experiences. The numbers didn't lie, and they painted a very different picture than the one Jessica had been carefully curating for years. Here was documented evidence of exactly how much free labor I'd been providing, how often Jessica had made last-minute demands on my time, how completely one-sided our relationship had become. The family group chat, usually bustling with activity and commentary, went completely silent. No one knew how to respond to this level of transparency about family dynamics that everyone had pretended not to notice. The invoice made it impossible to ignore the reality of the situation or to continue pretending that I was just being difficult or selfish. Jessica's response, when it finally came, was to leave the group chat entirely. No explanation, no defense of her actions, no acknowledgement of the debt. She simply disappeared from the conversation, taking her victim narrative with her. Over the next few days, I received private messages from various family members. Some were supportive, admitting they'd always wondered how Jessica could afford her lifestyle while complaining about money troubles. Others were critical, suggesting I'd gone too far in airing family business so publicly. But even the critical messages acknowledged the reality of what I'd been dealing with. My cousin Maria, who lived in Texas and only saw us at family reunions, sent a particularly validating message. "Girl, I've been wondering for years how Jessica could afford all those trips while crying poor. You've been getting played, and it's about time someone called her out." My Aunt Rosa, Mom's sister, was more diplomatic but equally revealing. "I raised 4 kids and never had help like that. Jessica doesn't know how good she had it." Even some of Jessica's friends reached out, having seen the screenshot when it inevitably made its way beyond family circles. Several admitted they'd always felt guilty asking Jessica to reciprocate babysitting favors, sensing that she somehow considered herself exempt from the mutual support that friendship required. The most surprising response came from Mike, Jessica's husband, who sent Lee a private message apologizing for his wife's behavior. He had no idea how much free childcare I'd been providing, or how frequently Jessica had been making demands on my time. He'd assumed she was paying me, or at least offering some form of reciprocal support. The revelation that I'd been subsidizing his wife's recreational activities with free labor while he traveled for work clearly disturbed him. Our parents' response was more complex. They were angry about the public nature of my invoice posting, embarrassed that family business had been aired so openly, but they couldn't deny the facts I'd presented. The numbers were too stark, the pattern too clear to dismiss or rationalize away. Mom called me a few days after the group chat incident, her voice carrying a weariness I'd never heard before. "Mija, why didn't you tell us how bad it had gotten?" The question surprised me. I had told them. I'd tried to express my frustration multiple times, only to be dismissed or guilt-tripped back into compliance. But I realized they'd never actually heard what I was saying because it didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed about family loyalty and sisterly support. "I did try to tell you, Mom. But every time I brought it up, you and Dad made me feel selfish for even having concerns. We talked for over an hour, the longest honest conversation we'd had in years." Mom admitted she'd been so focused on Jessica's struggles as a mother that she'd failed to see how those struggles were being unfairly transferred to me. She'd assumed I was happy doublers. To help, that I didn't mind sacrificing my weekends, that my childless life left me with endless free time to spare. The conversation wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a beginning. Mom didn't apologize for years of guilt trips and emotional manipulation, but she did acknowledge that I'd been carrying an unfair burden. She admitted that Jessica had perhaps become too comfortable relying on others to solve her problems, rather than finding sustainable solutions within her own resources. Dad's response was more predictably stubborn. He maintained that family should always help family, that I'd been wrong to put a price tag on love, that the invoice had been a cruel and unnecessary escalation. But even he couldn't argue with the documented evidence of how one-sided the arrangement had become. The real vindication came in the weeks that followed. As Jessica scrambled to arrange actual childcare for her holiday plans. Suddenly, she discovered what the rest of us already knew. Professional childcare is expensive, especially on short notice and during holidays. Her planned New Year's Eve retreat was canceled when she couldn't find affordable care. Her January spa weekend was postponed indefinitely, for the first time in years. Jessica had to actually parent her children on weekends, and the adjustment was clearly difficult. Her social media posts shifted from luxury experiences to complaints about being stuck at home with demanding kids. She lamented the lack of me time and the difficulty of finding work-life balance, as if she hadn't been enjoying unlimited me time subsidized by my unpaid labor. Meanwhile, I was rediscovering what weekends were supposed to feel like. I reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting, took up hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started dating someone I met at a bookstore on a Saturday afternoon I would have previously spent changing diapers and mediating sibling fights. The relationship with my nieces and nephew was more complicated to navigate. I still loved them deeply, but I needed to establish boundaries that protected my own well-being while maintaining meaningful connections with them. I started scheduling specific times to spend with them, planned activities that we could all enjoy, and made it clear that these visits were separate from any childcare arrangements their mother might need. Emma, being the oldest, understood the situation better than I'd expected. During one of our planned outings to the zoo, she asked why I didn't come over as much anymore. I explained, in age-appropriate terms, that I had my own life to live and couldn't always be available to watch them when their mom wanted to go out. "But you still love us, right?" she asked with 8-year-old directness. "Of course I love you," I assured her. "That's why I want to make sure that when we spend time together, it's because we both want to, not because someone else needs a favor." The concept of chosen versus obligated time seemed to resonate with her in a way that surprised me. She started asking for specific TIA dates, planned activities we could do together, and seemed to value our relationship more when it wasn't taken for granted. Liam and Sophia, being younger, adjusted more easily to the new dynamic. They were happy to see me when I visited on my own terms, and they didn't seem to notice or mind that I was no longer their default weekend caretaker. The family dynamics continued to evolve over the following months. Jessica initially maintained her position that I was wrong, cruel, and destroying family relationships over money. She painted herself as the victim of a mercenary sister who had betrayed family values for financial gain. But as time passed and she struggled to find affordable, reliable childcare, her narrative began to shift. She started acknowledging, in small ways, how much help I'd actually been providing. She mentioned to mutual acquaintances how difficult it was to find good babysitters. Expensive childcare had become. How challenging it was to manage 3 kids without regular support. These comments, while not direct apologies, were the closest she came to admitting that she'd been taking advantage of my generosity. Our parents gradually came around to understanding my perspective, though it took months of patient explanation and boundary setting. They began to see how their emphasis on family loyalty had been weaponized to justify one-sided relationships. They started asking about my life, my interests, my plans, rather than just assuming I was available for whatever family crisis needed managing. The most significant change was in how I viewed myself and my role within the family. For years, I'd defined my worth by how much I could sacrifice for others, how available I could be for everyone else's needs, how little I could ask for while getting everything. The Invoice incident forced me to confront the reality that this dynamic was neither healthy nor sustainable. I started therapy to work through years of ingrained people-pleasing behaviors, and boundary issues, I learned to recognize the difference between loving support and exploitative demands. I practiced saying no without extensive justification or guilt. I explored what it meant to have my own life, separate from my role as the family helper. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old guilt and obligation rose up like muscle memory. Family gatherings were awkward for months as everyone adjusted to the new dynamic where I wasn't automatically available for childcare duty. Some relatives continued to view me as selfish or difficult, unable to understand why I couldn't just go back to the way things were. But I also discovered something I'd forgotten in all those years of saying yes to everyone else. I actually liked myself when I wasn't constantly exhausted and resentful. I had interests, opinions, and dreams that extended beyond being helpful to others. I could form relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. The invoice itself was never paid. Despite my detailed documentation and clear payment terms, Jessica simply pretended it didn't exist. And I eventually decided that pursuing the money would cost more in emotional energy than it was worth. The real value of the invoice wasn't the $5,000 it represented, but the clarity it provided about the true nature of our relationship. By publicly itemizing the extent of my unpaid labor, I'd forced everyone in my family to confront the reality of how I'd been treated. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be rationalized away or dismissed as emotional overreaction. They provided concrete evidence of a pattern that had been invisible as long as everyone pretended it was normal. 6 months after the invoice incident, Jessica and I had our first real conversation in years. She called me on a Tuesday evening, not because she needed anything, but because she wanted to talk. The conversation was stilted and careful, both of us navigating new territory without the familiar scripts of demand and compliance. She didn't apologize directly, but she acknowledged that things had been unbalanced between us. She admitted that she'd gotten too comfortable relying on my help and that she hadn't always been considerate of my time and energy. It wasn't the full reckoning I might have hoped for, but it was a recognition that change was necessary. We talked about establishing a new relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Jessica expressed interest in getting to know me as a person rather than just as a childcare resource. She asked about my job, my hobbies, my dating life, topics that had been ignored for years while her needs dominated every conversation. The relationship we built from that conversation was different from what we had before, but it was also more genuine. When Jessica did need help with the kids, she asked politely and accepted no as a valid answer. When I offered to spend time with my nieces and nephew, it was because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated to. The children seemed to sense the difference too, treating our time together as special rather than routine. Our parents also learned to navigate the new family dynamic, though it took considerable adjustment. They stopped automatically assuming I was available for family emergencies and started treating my time and commitments as legitimate. When planning family gatherings, they actually asked about my schedule rather than just expecting me to rearrange my life to accommodate everyone else's needs. The extended family took longer to adjust, with some relatives continuing to view me as the troublemaker who'd disrupted family harmony over money. But others began sharing their own stories of feeling taken advantage of within family relationships, and I realized that my invoice had given permission for others to examine their own patterns of one-sided giving. My cousin David, who'd been his elderly mother's sole caregiver while his siblings offered only criticism and advice, started requiring his brothers to contribute financially to their mother's care. My Aunt Carmen, who'd been hosting every family gathering at her own expense while others just showed up empty-handed, began asking people to contribute dishes or money for shared meals. The ripple effects of setting boundaries extended far beyond my relationship with Jessica. By refusing to accept exploitation disguised as family love, I'd opened up space for others to examine their own relationships and make necessary changes. A year after sending that invoice, I received an unexpected message from a stranger who'd somehow heard my story through mutual connections. She was dealing with a similar situation with her own sister, feeling trapped by family expectations and guilt, while her own life disappeared into unpaid service for others. She wanted to know how I'd found the courage to change the dynamic, and whether I regretted making such a dramatic statement. I told her what I'd learned, that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. That love shouldn't require the complete sacrifice of your own well-being. That family relationships should be based on mutual respect and consideration, not one-sided obligation and guilt. And that sometimes it takes something dramatic and uncomfortable to force necessary conversations about unhealthy patterns. Did I regret sending the invoice? Not for a moment. It was the most honest communication I'd ever had with my family, even if it came in the form of an itemized bill. It forced everyone to confront the reality of how I'd been treated and opened up possibilities for healthier relationships based on actual respect rather than assumed servitude. The woman who'd reached out to me ended up sending her own version of my invoice to her family, documenting years of unpaid elder care while her siblings lived their lives unencumbered by responsibility. Her story had a different outcome than mine, with her family ultimately agreeing to hire professional help and share the costs equally, but the principle was the same. Sometimes you have to make invisible labor visible before people will acknowledge its value. Looking back now, I can see that the invoice was never really about the money. It was about dignity, recognition, and the radical idea that my time and energy had value. It was about refusing to accept that being childless meant being available for everyone else's needs. It was about demanding to be seen as a whole person rather than just a convenient resource. The $5,000 Jessica never paid represented so much more than babysitting fees. It represented years of canceled plans, missed opportunities, and a slowly eroding sense of self-worth. It represented the cost of being taken for granted by people who claimed to love me while treating me like hired help they didn't bother to pay. But more importantly, it represented my decision to finally value myself enough to demand better treatment. The invoice was my declaration of independence from a family dynamic that had been slowly killing my spirit, one unpaid weekend at a time. 2 years after the invoice incident, Jessica and I have settled into a relationship that works for both of us. She pays a babysitter when she needs childcare, and I spend time with my nieces and nephew because I want to, not because I'm obligated to. She's learned to manage her own responsibilities without assuming others will pick up the slack, and I've learned that saying no doesn't make me a bad person. The kids have adapted beautifully to having boundaries around our relationship. Emma, now 10, has become an incredibly empathetic child who asks before assuming anything from others. She seems to understand that the best relationships are chosen rather than demanded. Liam and Sophia treat our planned activities as special occasions rather than routine obligations, and their excitement when I visit is genuine rather than taken for granted. Our parents have also evolved in their understanding of healthy family dynamics. They've stopped using guilt and obligation as tools for managing adult children's behavior and started treating us as independent people capable of making our own decisions about how to spend our time, energy. They've even started setting their own boundaries, no longer automatically saying yes to every request for help or money. The most surprising outcome has been how the Invoice story has spread beyond our family and inspired others to examine their own relationships. I've received messages from people dealing with similar situations with siblings, parents, friends, and romantic partners who treat them as perpetual givers while offering little in return. A friend of a friend was inspired to calculate how much money she'd lent to her chronically irresponsible brother over the years, never to be repaid. The total was over $15,000. Money she'd sacrificed from her own savings while he spent freely on entertainment and luxury items. She didn't send him an invoice, but she did stop lending him money and started requiring him to solve his own financial crises. Another woman used my story as inspiration to address her own marriage, where she'd been handling all household labor while her husband pursued hobbies and social activities as if he were still single. She didn't itemize for domestic labor in invoice form, but she did sit down with him for a serious conversation about equitable distribution of responsibilities. Their marriage survived and thrived once both partners started contributing fairly to their shared life. The invoice became a symbol for something larger than just my specific situation with Jessica. It represented the idea that emotional labor, childcare, elder care, and other traditionally feminine forms of work have real value that deserves recognition and compensation. It challenged the assumption that women should provide unlimited support to others while asking for nothing in return. I've been asked to speak at workshops about setting boundaries in family relationships, sharing my story as an example of how to address exploitation disguised as love. The response is always mixed, with some people celebrating the idea of demanding fair treatment, while others are disturbed by the notion of applying business principles to family relationships. But I always explain that love and fairness aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, the healthiest relationships are built on mutual respect, consideration, and reciprocity. When one person gives everything while the other takes constantly, resentment builds, and genuine love erodes. Setting boundaries isn't about loving less, it's about loving sustainably. Jessica and I will never have the relationship we might have had if she treated me with respect from the beginning. Too much has happened, too many boundaries were crossed, too much resentment built up before I finally found the courage to say no. But we do have a relationship now that's honest and workable, which is more than I thought was possible during those dark months when she was calling me ungrateful and selfish. She's learned to be a more independent parent, managing her own responsibilities without assuming others will pick up the slack. I've learned to value my own time and energy enough to protect them from exploitation. Our children, watching these changes, are learning healthier patterns of giving and receiving support that will serve them well in their own future relationships. The ultimate irony is that by refusing to continue providing free childcare, I probably saved my relationship with my nieces and nephew. If I'd continued building resentment while sacrificing my own well-being for their mother's convenience, I would have eventually burned out completely and withdrawn from their lives entirely. By setting boundaries, I was able to maintain a loving relationship with them while protecting my own mental health. The invoice may have seemed harsh, even cruel, to people who didn't understand the full context of what I'd been experiencing. But sometimes gentle conversations and subtle hints aren't enough to change deeply entrenched patterns of behavior. Sometimes you need to make a dramatic statement that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about how they've been treating others. Looking at that invoice now, saved in my email drafts as a reminder of my own capacity for self-advocacy, I'm struck by how clinical and businesslike it appears. But beneath those neat columns of hours and rates was years of accumulated hurt, frustration, and a growing recognition that I deserved better treatment from the people who claimed to love me. The $5,000 was never really the point, though I wouldn't have minded receiving it. The point was forcing my family to acknowledge the extent of my unpaid contributions and the completely one-sided nature of my relationship with Jessica. The point was making visible all the invisible labor I'd been providing while my own needs and desires were ignored or dismissed. Most importantly, the point was reclaiming my right to have my own life, separate from everyone else's expectations and demands. The invoice was my way of saying that I mattered, that my time had value, that I deserved to be treated with the same consideration I'd been showing others for years. Did it work? In ways I never could have imagined. Not only did it change my family dynamics, but it inspired others to examine their own relationships and demand better treatment. It opened up conversations about the value of emotional labor and the importance of reciprocity in healthy relationships. It gave me back my weekends, my social life, and my sense of self-worth. The silence that followed my posting that invoice in the family group chat was indeed sweet, but not because it represented victory over my family. It was sweet because it represented the end of a pattern that had been slowly destroying my spirit and the beginning of relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their worst behaviors. Sometimes setting boundaries is the greatest gift you can give to relationships that have become toxic through unequal giving and receiving. And sometimes a professionally formatted invoice is exactly the wake-up call everyone needs to start treating each other with the respect that genuine love requires. That invoice changed everything, and I've never looked back. My weekends are my own again. My relationships are based on choice rather than obligation, and I finally understand what it feels like to be valued rather than taken for granted. The price of that transformation was worth every uncomfortable moment that followed, every difficult conversation, every family gathering that felt awkward as everyone adjusted to the new reality. I'm Sarah Martinez, 28 years old, and I'm no longer anyone's unpaid babysitter. I'm a daughter, a sister, an aunt, and a woman with my own dreams and priorities. I'm someone who learned that teaching people how to treat you sometimes requires sending them a bill for services they never appreciated when they were free. And I'm living proof that it's never too late to start valuing yourself enough to demand the respect you've always deserved. But the story doesn't end there. Life has a way of testing your resolve long after you think you've solved a problem, and my family dynamics were about to face their biggest challenge yet. 3 months after Jessica had seemingly accepted our new boundaries, she called me with news that changed everything. Mike had been offered a promotion that would require him to relocate to Seattle for 6 months, leaving Jessica alone with the 3 kids during a crucial period in his career. The opportunity was too good to pass up, but it meant Jessica would be essentially single parenting for half a year while managing her own part-time job at the local elementary school. The old Sarah would have immediately offered to help, would have rearranged her entire life to make Jessica's situation more manageable. But the new Sarah, the one who'd learned to value her own time and energy, listened carefully before responding. "That sounds really challenging, Jess. What's your plan for managing everything while Mike's away?" The question seemed to surprise her. She'd clearly expected an immediate offer of assistance, a return to the old dynamic now that she faced a genuinely difficult situation. When I didn't volunteer my services, she began painting an increasingly desperate picture of her circumstances. She talked about the impossibility of managing school drop-offs and pickups with her work schedule, the challenge of handling bedtime routines alone, the exhaustion of being the only adult responsible for 3 children's needs. She mentioned her concerns about Sophia's recent behavioral issues, Emma's struggles with math homework, and Liam's need for consistent discipline and structure. I listened with genuine empathy, recognizing that her situation was indeed difficult. But I also noticed that her proposed solutions all seemed to involve other people solving her problems, rather than her adapting to her circumstances. She'd already approached our parents about providing daily childcare, contacted her mother-in-law about extended visits, and reached out to several friends about regular help with school transportation. "Have you looked into after-school programs or extended daycare options?" I asked, genuinely curious about what professional support might be available. Jessica's response revealed the core issue that had always defined our relationship. She'd researched these options extensively, but found them either too expensive or not flexible enough for her needs. Professional childcare providers had contracts, policies, and limitations that didn't accommodate her desire for completely customizable support. Family members, on the other hand, could be guilted into providing unlimited flexibility at no cost. "Those programs are so impersonal," she explained. "The kids need family support during this transition, not strangers who don't really care about them. Plus, the costs would eat up most of what I make at the school. It doesn't make financial sense to pay for childcare, when family could help instead." There it was, the familiar logic that had trapped me for years. Professional services were too expensive and impersonal, but family labor was free and available. The assumption that family members should provide professional-level services without professional compensation or boundaries remained unchanged, despite everything that had happened with the invoice. I found myself at a crossroads. Jessica was facing a genuinely difficult situation that warranted support and sympathy, but she was also falling back into the same patterns of thinking that had led to years of exploitation. She needed help, but she expected that help to come in the form of unlimited, unpaid services from family members who were supposed to sacrifice their own needs for her convenience. "What kind of help are you hoping for from family?" I asked, wanting to understand exactly what she was requesting before making any commitments. Jessica's answer confirmed my suspicions. She needed someone to handle school drop-offs 3 days a week, pick-up duties every day, evening childcare when she had to work late or attend school events, weekend backup when the kids were sick or had conflicts with friends, and general emotional support during Mike's absence. In other words, she needed a part-time nanny, full-time babysitter, and personal assistant rolled into one convenient family member. The request was presented as temporary, just for the 6 months while Mike was away, and she emphasized how much the kids loved spending time with their TIA. But I recognized the familiar pattern of scope creep that had characterized our previous arrangement. What started as occasional help always expanded into regular expectations, and temporary situations had a way of becoming permanent arrangements. "I understand this is a difficult situation," I said carefully, "but I can't commit to that level of regular childcare. I have my own job and responsibilities, and I've learned that I need to maintain boundaries around my time." Jessica's response was immediate and intense. The tears came first, followed by accusations that I was abandoning her during the most challenging period of her life. She reminded me of all the times she'd helped me, though when pressed for specifics, she couldn't provide any concrete examples. She painted pictures of the children suffering without adequate family support, of her mental health deteriorating under the pressure of single parenting, of Mike's career being damaged if she couldn't manage the home front effectively. The guilt tactics were familiar, but they felt different now. Instead of automatically triggering my compliance reflexes, they helped me recognize how deeply entrenched Jessica's sense of entitlement to other people's labor had become. Even after the Invoice incident, even after months of supposedly accepting new boundaries, she still fundamentally believed that her problems were my responsibility to solve. Jessica, I care about you and the kids, but I can't be your solution to this situation. You need to find sustainable, professional support that doesn't depend on family members rearranging their lives for your convenience. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Jessica cycling through the full range of emotional manipulation techniques. I was selfish for prioritizing my own comfort over her family's needs. I was cold and calculating, treating family relationships like business transactions. I was punishing innocent children for adult disagreements. I was destroying the family bonds that held us together during difficult times. But this time, her words didn't have the same power over me. I'd heard these arguments before, had spent months in therapy learning to recognize manipulation disguised as emotional appeal. I understood now that genuine love doesn't require the complete sacrifice of your own well-being, and that healthy support systems are built on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The call ended with Jessica hanging up on me, but not before promising that our parents would hear about my refusal to help during her time of need. I knew I was about to face another round of family pressure, but I felt more prepared this time. I'd learned to articulate my boundaries clearly and to resist the guilt tactics that had controlled me for so long. Sure enough, Mom called the next morning, her voice heavy with disappointment and concern. Jessica had painted a heartbreaking picture of her situation, emphasizing her isolation and the children's need for family support. Mom couldn't understand how I could be so unfeeling toward my sister's genuine crisis, especially when the help was only needed temporarily. Mija, this isn't about babysitting every weekend for spa trips. This is about helping your sister survive a genuinely difficult period. The children need stability, and you're the person they trust most after their parents. How can you turn your back on them when they need you? The conversation was different from our previous arguments because Mom was no longer dismissing my concerns or pretending that I hadn't been providing valuable services. She acknowledged that I'd been taken advantage of in the past, but argued that this situation was different because Jessica's need was real and temporary rather than recreational and ongoing. I had to admit that Mom had a point. Jessica's situation was genuinely challenging, and the children would indeed benefit from family support during their father's absence. But I also recognized that the difference between recreational and necessary help didn't change the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. Jessica still expected unlimited flexibility and availability from family members while being unwilling to pay for professional services that came with clear boundaries and expectations. Mom, I understand that Jessica's situation is difficult, but she's asking for the equivalent of a part-time nanny without any of the structure or compensation that would normally come with that level of support. If I agree to this, what happens when 6 months turns into 8 months? Or when Mike's next promotion requires more travel? Or when Jessica decides she likes having regular childcare support and doesn't want to give it up? The question seemed to give Mom pause. She'd witnessed the scope creep that had characterized my previous arrangement with Jessica, had seen how temporary help had become permanent expectations. But she struggled with the idea that family members shouldn't be automatically available for each other's crises, regardless of the personal cost. We talked for over an hour, exploring different ways to provide meaningful support without falling back into unhealthy patterns. I suggested that Jessica look into hiring a mother's helper, someone who could provide regular after-school care at reasonable rates. I offered to contribute financially to professional childcare costs, recognizing that Mike's temporary relocation was indeed a family situation that warranted collective support. But Jessica rejected these suggestions when Mom passed them along. She didn't want a stranger in her house, didn't trust daycare programs to handle her children's specific needs, and felt hurt that family members would offer money instead of personal involvement. She wanted the unlimited flexibility and personal attention that only family could provide, but without the reciprocal obligations that healthy relationships require. The standoff continued for weeks, with Jessica refusing professional childcare options and me maintaining my boundaries around unpaid family labor. Our parents found themselves caught in the middle, sympathetic to Jessica's genuine challenges, but increasingly aware of the problematic dynamics that had led to this impasse. The situation came to a head when Emma called me directly, something she'd never done before. Her 8-year-old voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath her composure. "Tia Seta, Mom says you don't want to help us anymore because Uncle Mike is going away. She's been crying a lot, and she says we might have to move in with Abuela because she can't take care of us by herself. Are you really not going to help us?" The conversation broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Emma was clearly caught in the middle of adult conflicts she didn't understand, absorbing stress and anxiety that weren't appropriate for a child her age. Jessica had obviously been sharing her fears and frustrations with the children, making them feel responsible for adult problems and using their emotional distress as leverage against me. I spent a long time explaining to Emma that I loved her and her siblings very much, that the problems between the adults weren't her fault, and that there were many ways to get help that didn't involve family members giving up their own lives. I assured her that no matter what happened with the childcare arrangements, she would always have a relationship with me based on love rather than obligation. But the call also clarified something important for me. Jessica wasn't just asking for help with her situation. She was actively involving her children in adult conflicts and using their emotional well-being as a weapon against family members who set boundaries. This behavior was harmful to the children and manipulative toward the adults, crossing lines that went far beyond simple requests for support. I called Mom immediately after talking to Emma, sharing my concerns about Jessica involving the children in adult disagreements and using their distress to pressure family members. Mom was clearly disturbed by this information, recognizing that such behavior could cause lasting emotional harm to the children. "She scared me, huh? People don't always make good decisions when they're frightened and overwhelmed. But you're right that the children shouldn't be put in the middle of these conflicts." That conversation led to a family meeting, the first one we'd had since the Invoice incident. Jessica, our parents, and I sat around Mom's kitchen table, the same place where countless family decisions had been made over the years. But this time, the dynamic was different. Instead of everyone ganging up on me to provide unlimited support, we were having an honest conversation about sustainable solutions to Jessica's challenges. Jessica began by apologizing for involving the children in adult conflicts, acknowledging that her stress had led to some poor decisions about what to share with them. She admitted that she'd been hoping to recreate the old arrangement where I provided regular childcare, but she understood now that those expectations weren't fair or realistic. "I guess I got used to having unlimited backup," she said, her voice small and tired. "When you were always available, I never had to develop other support systems or learn to manage everything on my own. Now that I actually need help, I realize how dependent I'd become on your sacrifice." It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd ever received from Jessica, and it opened up space for a more productive conversation about actual solutions. We discussed professional childcare options, community resources, and ways that family members could provide meaningful support without anyone bearing an unfair burden. The solution we eventually reached was more complex than Jessica's original request, but more sustainable than the old arrangement. Our parents agreed to help with school transportation 2 days a week, on a schedule that worked with their own commitments. I committed to one weekend evening of childcare per month, with clear start and end times and advanced scheduling. Jessica's mother-in-law agreed to visit for 1 week each month, providing intensive support during particularly challenging periods. Most importantly, Jessica agreed to hire a part-time after-school babysitter to handle the daily childcare needs that were beyond what family members could reasonably provide. The cost was significant, but Mike's promotion came with a salary increase that made professional childcare financially feasible if they adjusted their other spending priorities. The arrangement wasn't perfect, and it required ongoing negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed. But it was based on mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than assumed obligation and unlimited availability. Jessica learned to plan ahead, to communicate her needs clearly, and to accept that professional support was sometimes more appropriate than family labor. The children adopted to the new routine more easily than any of the adults had expected. Having consistent, predictable childcare arrangements actually reduced their anxiety compared to the constant uncertainty about who would be available when. Emma, in particular, seemed relieved that the adults in her life had stopped fighting about who was responsible for her care. Mike's 6 months in Seattle were challenging but manageable with the structured support system we'd created. Jessica developed confidence in her ability to handle single parenting, discovering reserves of strength and resourcefulness she hadn't known she possessed. The children learned independence and resilience, adapting to new routines and caregivers with remarkable flexibility. Most surprisingly, the experience brought our family closer together in some ways. By forcing honest conversations about expectations and boundaries, we'd cleared the air of years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Our parents learned to see me as an individual with my own needs, rather than just a resource for solving family problems. Jessica developed appreciation for the sacrifices others had made on her behalf and learned to ask for help in healthier ways. When Mike returned from Seattle, the family dynamics had shifted permanently. Jessica had learned to manage her responsibilities without depending on unlimited family support. I had maintained my boundaries while still providing meaningful help when appropriate. Our parents had discovered that treating adult children as independent individuals actually strengthened family relationships rather than weakening them. The Invoice incident, which had seemed so destructive at the time, had ultimately forced conversations and changes that made our family healthier and more functional. By refusing to accept exploitation disguised as love, I'd created space for genuine affection based on mutual respect and consideration. Jessica and I developed a friendship during that period that we'd never had as children or young adults. Without the constant tension over childcare expectations, we were able to discover shared interests and values that had been obscured by years of resentment. We started having regular coffee dates, just the two of us, talking about books, politics, and personal dreams, rather than just logistical arrangements and family obligations. The children benefited enormously from seeing the adults in their family resolve conflicts through honest communication rather than guilt, manipulation, or silent resentment. They learned that healthy relationships require ongoing negotiation and mutual consideration, lessons that would serve them well in their own future relationships. Looking back now, I can see that the Invoice was just the beginning of a longer process of learning to value myself and demand appropriate treatment from others. It took months of therapy, difficult conversations, and consistent boundary setting to fully transform the family dynamics that had been decades in the making. But the transformation was worth every uncomfortable moment, every guilt trip, every accusation of selfishness. I learned that it's possible to love your family deeply while also protecting your own well-being. I discovered that the healthiest relationships are built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than assumed servitude. The story of that invoice has continued to ripple outward, inspiring conversations about family dynamics, emotional labor, and the importance of boundaries in relationships. I've received messages from people around the world who found the courage to address similar situations in their own families, workplaces, and friendships. Each story is different, but the underlying principle remains the same. You teach people how to treat you, and sometimes that requires making uncomfortable statements about your worth and your limits. Sometimes love means saying no, setting boundaries, and refusing to enable behaviors that harm both the giver and the receiver. I'm still Sarah Martinez, still 28 years old, still learning every day about what it means to live authentically while maintaining meaningful relationships with others. I'm proof that it's never too late to change family dynamics, to demand better treatment, and to create space for genuine love based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The invoice may have been about childcare services, but its real value was in teaching me that I deserve to be valued, respected, and treated with the same consideration I show others. That lesson has transformed not just my family relationships, but every aspect of my life, from my career to my friendships to my romantic relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's worst behaviors. Sometimes the healthiest families are built on honest boundaries rather than unlimited sacrifice. And sometimes a simple invoice can change everything, opening up possibilities for relationships based on genuine care rather than convenient exploitation. The silence that followed posting that invoice was indeed sweet, but what came after was even sweeter. Authentic relationships built on mutual respect, personal growth through honest self-reflection, and the deep satisfaction of finally valuing myself enough to demand the treatment I'd always deserved.